Good morning. Before we can further understand the workings of this little horn, I thought it important for us to pause for a moment and go back to the experiences of this person, Moses. According to the history books, he was born around 1608 BCE. I want you to read Exodus chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3 in order to get a background to Moses, where he was born, his circumstances, and the first 80 years of his life. But I want you to join me in Exodus chapter 20, where we see how that God has given us a verbal account of his 10 commandments. In verse 22, we read this. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites this." Before I go further, the word Israelite here doesn't necessarily refer to a group of people, but the word Israelite actually takes us back to the story of Jacob, where he wrestles with God, and God changes his name from Jacob, one who deceives, to one who has wrestled with God and prevailed. And the word for that is Israel. So God is saying to us who have wrestled with God, this is what God is saying. You've seen for yourselves that I've spoken to you from heaven. Do not make any gods to be alongside me. Do not make for yourselves gods of silver or gods of gold. It's interesting that God says to Moses, tell those who've wrestled with me what they have seen. In Exodus chapter 24, we find that when Moses addresses the people, it says there in verse 3, when Moses went and told the people, the Israelites, all the Lord's words and the laws, they responded with one voice, everything the Lord has said, we will do. Moses then wrote down everything the Lord had said. So we see right here that there is a verbal agreement which is now put in writing between those who've wrestled with God and the God of heaven. From there we see how that he goes down and he takes this book of the covenant that he's written and he ratifies it in blood. In verse 7 we read this, then he took the book of the covenant and read it to the people. So after signing the agreement, he reads it to the people again. And in verse 7 they say, we will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey. So they are in agreement with this contract. They are willing to obey. Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So this agreement is ratified and it's put in writing. I want you to then notice that in verse 12, the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandments I've written for their instruction. So he calls up Moses into the mountain to receive the 10 commandments written down on tablets of stone. We find in verse 18 that Moses entered the cloud, and it says there, and he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Now just a little while later, not even 40 days, 40 nights later, the people have become despondent. They don't see Moses anymore, and they ask Aaron to make for them a golden image so that they could worship it. It's strange, dear friends. Right here, we are reminded that God said, don't make anything with your hands out of gold or silver. Don't bow down and worship it. But here they do this. Moses is still in discussion with God. And I want you to read the first part of Exodus chapter 32. But I want to go to verse 15. Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. So we see here quite clearly that Moses has now in his possession the covenant agreement that has been put in writing between God and man. When he gets to the bottom, verse 19, when Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. Here we see that the covenant agreement is broken by this very action. Moses then deals with the people. In Exodus 34 verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke." So it's interesting, he says to him, chisel out of the sapphire stone, chisel out tablets for me so that I can write on them again. Verse 4, so Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and went up Mount Sinai early in the morning as the Lord had commanded him. So he goes up into the mountains carrying the tablets of stone. The very interesting thing is that God says to him there in verse 10, then the Lord said, "I'm making a covenant with you. Before all your people, I will do wonders never before done in any nation in all the world." You know, dear friends, we see right here that God was willing to re-establish his covenant agreement and promises to do great things for them. But you know, the people resist, and we find they have to go back into the desert for another 40 years where God has to teach them. When they come out of the desert, we are introduced to a reminder of why they were in the desert and what they were to remember. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, Moses gives to them again the 10 commandments. And he advises them that this is, especially the 4th commandment, was to remind them that God was their Savior, that he had taken them out of slavery, and that he was going to redeem them. I want you to notice that in chapter 6, these are the commandments, decrees, and laws that the Lord your God directed me to teach you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess. So they're about to enter the promised land. And I want you to notice that they are instructed that they are going to keep these commandments and these laws in the land that they are about to enter. In verse 4 we hear this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." It's almost as if God is trying to say through Moses, make everything that we have done or drawn up in our covenant agreement, make it part of your lives. Let it filter into every aspect of your life. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, we start again with verse 1. "Be careful to follow every command I'm giving you today." There's this calling to be careful, to take special notice of what has been said. It says further in verse 2, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the desert these 40 years. He's saying, remember what God has been trying to teach you in these 40 years. How that God wasn't only giving you food, manna from heaven, but that he was giving you the words of life. And then we read these words that Jesus had quoted when the devil had tempted him. It says there, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes out of the mouth of God. Dear friends, I want you to notice, I want to draw your attention to the fact that God's laws weren't just verbal, they've been put into writing so that they cannot be altered, changed in any way, or annulled. They are to be kept here And the interesting news is that they will be taken with us, and we'll be keeping them in heaven, in the promised land. They are to become part and parcel of our lives, not only here, but will be part and parcel of our lives in heaven. Why this is so important is we're going to notice that this little horn attacks the very writings of God. We've noticed this in the past, but I'm going to draw your attention to very interesting specifics about how this little horn attempts to get us to forget that God is the creator and that we are his creation.